Protests and political threats. India is in the midst of significant economic reforms as the government unexpectedly moves to boost slowing growth. To tell us more about what the reforms will mean for the nation's bottom line, here's Kasi Rao. He is a consultant and advisor on the Canada-India file, and we welcome you to TVO, Kasi.
Thank you, Steve.
Nice to see you again. I guess I met you many, many years ago when you were working at University of Toronto and then in the Peterson government.
Yes, thank you.
India's growth rate, just about 7 or 8% for most of the last decade, and now we notice that it's under 6% now. That's not good. What accounts for that?
I think there has been a sense that that the reforms that were initiated 20 years ago, 21 years ago, stalled about 5 years ago. And I think that accounts for a large part of it. Of course, the global financial crisis. But I wouldn't play the global financial crisis too much. I think there were mainly domestic reasons, a sense of policy paralysis. And I think the combination of all of these factors lent to a very tepid sense of growth in the last few years.
I want to pick up on that because you no doubt saw The Economist magazine earlier this year when they said the concept of the BRIC nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, had led to what they called a bubble of complacency. Does that jibe for you?
I don't know if it's so much a bubble of complacency. I think the sense that the world is changing and we need to adjust to the new realities was, I think, how certainly the sense within the BRIC countries. And I think in the case of India, the view was initially that you could take care of, to some extent, you could immunize yourself from the global situation, mainly because the growth, unlike China's, was consumption-led as opposed to investment-driven.
And they thought their economy would grow no matter what.
To some extent, yes.
And guess what they've learned? It's not the case.
Yeah, the whole notion of decoupling and all of that, I think, has kind of disappeared from the lexicon of various thinkers.
So would you say that the era of rapid growth is now over?
I think the era of rapid growth is over in the sense that from the short to medium-term perspective, I think you're looking at, perhaps 6% and maybe numbers like that, as opposed to the aspirational goal, which is to get to 9%.
What's the number one economic challenge right now, then?
I think a number of things. The simplest way, perhaps, to look at it is a combination of the infrastructure issue, both in terms of hard infrastructure, sort of something we'd be typically familiar with, roads, highways, ports, that kind of thing, as well as the soft infrastructure, which is the demographic dividend that is now evident in India and perhaps nowhere else in the world, requires some serious policy changes to take advantage of that demographic dividend.
Okay, you put infrastructure at the top there, and I can't help but notice that 620 million Indians lost power last year, right? The electricity went out. What would you put as the state of India's infrastructure today? That's probably not indicative of everything, but how are things overall?
I would say it is perhaps the number one policy challenge. But the good news here is, depending on your view, whether you see it as half full or half empty, but I think an optimistic view would be that the percentage of GDP that is going to be ascribed to the infrastructure file is going to go from somewhere like 5% towards 9%. And a good indication of that would be the construction of some fairly significant international infrastructure projects. I would give you the example of about 3 or 4 airports in Bangalore, Hyderabad. Those would be some examples of where you see the new regime kicking in, which is public-private partnerships. And you think of something like, the Delhi subway system. This is now viewed as an incredible success story, both on budget, on time, and they've just landed a fairly significant contract over the weekend in Indonesia. So I think the infrastructure story is perhaps the number one bottleneck. But the way to look at it is the way it was 5 years ago is not the way it is now, which is still not adequate. But I think what you will see going forward is further dramatic improvements, because without that change, the manufacturing sector, which is about 1/6 of the economy, for it to get to 1/5 or 1/4 requires obviously attention to the infrastructure story.
I think I said that power loss happened last year. It was actually just this past summer. But one wonders whether or not that calls into question the confidence that Indians have in their government's ability to provide kind of the basics that, as you say, they need to move forward. What do you think on that?
I think we've moved from think of it as exuberance to measured confidence. I think there is a sense. You think about the last 10 years. In a way, the Indian middle class, and I'm not talking about the entire population, but the Indian middle class, the growing middle class, has experienced nothing but growth. And I think this is the first challenge where you've gone from 9–10% growth to now half that number to 5%. So I would say what is perhaps more important is that this sense of measured confidence now is resulting in demands of the government and demands of the system that the status quo is not acceptable.
Let me express some mild surprise that when I asked you what the number one problem was, you said infrastructure and not corruption. Because we know that, I want to get the number right here, the World Bank says out of 183 countries, India is 132nd. 132nd out of 183 in what it calls the ease of doing business, which we all know is a euphemism for corruption. What does that tell you?
I think what it tells you is that absolutely it's perhaps the most significant policy challenge as it relates to the democratic structure of the country. And there, what I mean by that is, think of it as, Steve, good news and bad news. So the bad news is the numbers that we've seen on various examples of corruption over the last few years. But the good news is, I'd say 2 or 3 things. Number one is, this has been unearthed by the Indian system. Number 2 is that what you see is the mobilization of the masses saying this is not acceptable anymore. And I think that is where you're starting to see these changes taking place in terms of, from a policy standpoint. There's nothing new about the corruption story. I think what's new are 2 things. One is the size. That is new, which is in part reflective of the Indian growth story. And I think the second part that's new is that this is being unearthed and coming more and more into the public.
Well, let me pick up on the issue of the size of it, because I noted in some of the research that I read, the government has been accused of misallocating coal blocks during a 5-year period, costing $34 billion. $34 billion in coal blocks. How does that happen?
Well, I think in this particular instance, what happened was that you had a series of licenses allocated, and the licenses were allocated by the government, not necessarily through a competitive process, in which private sector companies felt shut out. And I think what you had was this notion of state-run enterprises and the allocation of licenses to the state-run enterprises. But here again, I think a couple of things are in order. One is the anticipated revenue is according to the lines you've mentioned, the 34–35 billion number. But the interesting part in these kinds of examples is that if you look at the participation of Indian companies into the policy process, you will see that, for example, the technology companies are nowhere close to these kinds of scandals. And I think the challenge now is what the technology companies have accomplished by being clean and being above board, that will now start translating more and more into the manufacturing and the other side. And the reason for optimism here are a number of things. One is there are now legislative vehicles in place. So the right to information, for example, which we've had some experience with in this country, RTI as it's called, is now a process by which any citizen can ask on any given subject what's going on. And then you have sort of mass political movements, not by the elites or just the upper middle class, but this is the common populace saying, you know what, this is not acceptable.
Okay, so that's the glass half full story, but I wonder whether the glass half empty part of it, namely the infrastructure deficit, the corruption issues, to what extent do those prevent India from becoming the great and modern country that it wants to be?
I think that it's a work in progress. I think that's how I see it. And if you look at the spate of announcements, particularly in the last 10 days or so, I think they point to that direction, which is that these policy reforms will be critical to India's aspirational success in the economic dimension. So the changes that you're going to see in the supply chain and the infrastructure aspect by allowing foreign investors to come in, I think all of that will point to sort of a more cautiously optimistic.
Let me put some numbers your way. This is from the Pew Research Center, which is a pretty reputable outfit. And these numbers are just from a few weeks ago. They say 59% dissatisfied with India's direction, 59%. Only 38% satisfied, which is apparently a 13% decline in the satisfaction rate from this time last year. How do you explain that?
I think, as I said earlier, what you see happening is the sense for economic growth, which increasingly a number of people in the middle class and entering the middle class took for granted, and took to be that this was only natural. I think now what you see is that is not natural. It requires a set of deliberative policy changes to take place, not all of which are easy. And I think the sense of exuberance has kind of gone down to more cautious optimism. And I would say, relatively speaking, the mood in India is still, and again here I focus on the middle class, still cautiously positive.
Okay, but the political leadership of India, how are they responding to what is obviously a new reality in their lives?
And I think that's what you've seen by way of response. I think what you see, particularly in the last 2 weeks, is that a government that has refound its political footing, policy footing, has taken some bold initiatives to push back at critics and to implement some changes. I think that's where you're starting to see the move from the era of policy paralysis, which seemed to be in place over the last 18 months, to a more aggressive stance, at times almost reminiscent, although I would not draw the analogy too much, to 1991. When the country was facing a similar set of challenges. So, for example, in this case, it was the prospect at a downgrade by the financial markets, which was sort of staring India in the face, in part, which prompted these changes.
I want to put some more numbers on the table here. India is expected to add 130 million people in the age demographic of 20 to 49 over the next 15 years. 130 million people aged 20 to 49 over the next 15 years, that according to the United Nations. The conventional wisdom might be, oh my God, is there a way that could work in India's favor?
I think very much so. And I think, again, not to be starry-eyed about this, because the demographic dividend and the demographic bulge that you're going to see in India is actually going to also occur in some of the poorest states, poorest provinces in India. So the dividend is both an opportunity and a challenge. The opportunity is that India, unlike many of the countries in the West, and indeed many of the Asian tigers, including China, South Korea, Japan's already there, is not an aging country. So India will continue to be young. And therefore, the view is amongst Indian policymakers that if they get this side of the equation right, that is providing opportunities for the demographic bulge, not only will it serve India's needs, but indeed it could serve the world's needs in the coming 20, 25, 30 years. That's the opportunity side of it. The challenge side of it is that, as I said, most of this growth is taking place in the poorest of Indian states. And therefore, how you make these changes and facilitate entry of these young people into the labor force becomes one of the topmost policy challenges.
Sure. Where do you see the jobs coming from?
So I think here, the current model of sort of depending or over-dependence on the service sector is unsustainable. And therefore, the changes that will have to take place are in the manufacturing side. And the policy statement, now we'll see how it translates into reality in the coming year, but the reason for optimism is it's the first explicit statement by the government of India to move the manufacturing share of the economy from roughly about a sixth to about a fourth in the coming 10 years. So that is 100 million jobs to create over the next 10 to 15 years.
But that requires they get all those other aspects right.
Which means that the infrastructure aspect needs to take place. It can't happen just by government, so you're going to look at public-private partnerships, you're going to look at more foreign entrants, and then concomitantly, you're going to look at the soft infrastructure, which is the think of it as the education training side of it. An Indian government document about 5 years ago, and it's now starting to make its way through the policy process, wants to quintuple its expenditure on higher education, both sort of for high-end research, access, training, all of those kinds of things. And that's where you're going to see the combination of, if you will, soft infrastructure and hard infrastructure coming into greater convergence in the coming years.
Kasi, we got a couple of minutes left here, and I want to ask you about you. You're born in Ottawa.
Yes.
But you have an accent. Want to explain that to me?
Thank you. I was born in Ottawa. I'm a son of an Indian diplomat, and I grew up in different parts of the world, including the then Soviet Union, and then an Indian protectorate called Sikkim, which is now part of the Indian state now. And then the bulk of my education were in two Indian cities, Bangalore in the south and Delhi in the north. I came back to Canada 31 years ago in the summer of 1980 for my higher education. And so, whatever the accent is, I think it's a combination of all of this. But I think there also what I would say is I go to India about 3 to 5 times a year. And you see a remarkable shift in the attitudes of young people. So my generation that left India, if you will, in 1980, there was a sense of obsession with leaving India because the opportunities weren't there, and you just went out wherever you need to go out. And I think you don't see that now. And to the extent you see sort of the global Indians going, they go and they see it as wherever they go to get a good education. But then, not surprisingly, look at coming back to India. And I think that's really the face of the new India.
Can you imagine? I asked Anand Girdardas, who writes for the New York Times, about this, because he's born here as well.
I think he grew up in Ohio, if I recall correctly. I think in Cleveland.
And lives in New York now, I guess. Yeah. But has ties. His soul feels like it ought to be over there. Do you imagine yourself moving there someday?
I don't imagine myself moving there. But what I see, and I see this especially amongst young Canadians, is that the notion of a global Canadian. And the global Canadian, you see it most evident in Canadian business schools, but I think it's going to go well beyond Canadian business schools. So I think if you look at, the students of today who are going into MBA programs and all that, you're struck by 2 or 3 things. One, how truly international those particular programs are. And second, that, in a way, the elite of tomorrow in this country, in Canada, they recognize that there is, to borrow a phrase from Wendy Dobson, there is a gravity shift that's taken place, and you need to go and experience the world. So to the extent, I can be a part of that as a global Canadian, I see that as opposed to, moving to India.
Great. Kasi Rao, it's great to see you again, and thanks so much for being with us here tonight on TVO.
Thank you very much for having me, Steve.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.